Okay, Samuel, I think we can start.
That looks wonderful. Welcome, everybody, to this last of our seminars of this year, of this season. Elena Avalav's seminar on the history of astronomy and astrology. I'm very pleased to see many familiar names, familiar faces. It's wonderful to have you all here. And I want to start to thank our speaker, Stephen Johnston, who has kindly accepted to speak to us today. This is wonderful. Stephen is a wonderful colleague and friend, and I'm very pleased that you're here, Stephen. He does not really need an introduction for many of us who are here, but I hope and I'm sure there are also some newcomers. So let me just summarize quickly, remind you that Stephen is curator emeritus at the History of Science Museum at the University of Oxford. And he's emeritus, but still very much active as far as I can tell. Originally studied in Cambridge, actually, and under the supervision of Jim Bennett. He has worked on the topics of mathematical practice and material culture, mostly in the early modern, and increasingly now also the medieval times. After his curatorial post at London Science Museum in the 80s and 90s, he moved to Oxford as the assistant keeper and remained at the History of Science Museum until he was head of research, teaching, and collections until 2022. He has curated many, many exhibitions. In our blurb, we just choose 3 of them to give you a taste of what's going on. So the themes range from all in history of science, the geometry of war, 1500, 750, or Geek is Good in 2014. And not forgetting, and that's relevant for today's paper, the Astrolabe, East and West. And so we're back talking about the Astrolabe, but the story has not ended yet. So we will learn many more things about the Astrolabe today. Thank you so much, Stephen. So if you have any issues with sound, just write into the chat so we can kind of correct this. And we are, if I remember well, our sessions are about an hour, but well, you're free to talk a little less, so we have time to have questions and a discussion after your talk. Or if you prefer, you can also choose to get questions in the middle of your talk and more go in the style of Karin Schemla's seminars. It's as you wish. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Samuel. And very good to be here, and good to see so many familiar names in the participants there. So I'm going to be talking astrology and the Astrolabe, and I was pleased to see that Daryl Rutkin was in the room, because my first slide is just thinking about, so what's the big story that one can tell, and Daryl has been, has got part 1 of 3, this work on Sapienta Astrologica, and what Daryl has been doing is looking at the overall framework for astrology in the medieval, early modern period, thinking about its philosophical, theological foundations, so that we can understand properly how it integrated a whole range of disciplines in the medieval period, and also how it came to lose its central position in the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe. And that's one very important approach to be adopting. But there are other recent approaches that are worth emphasizing, I think, and particularly in this seminar, Helena Avelar's work on an astrologer at work in late medieval France, and this is very different in style. It's very particular. It's a return to practice, taking astrological technique seriously, and that was done through looking at working notebooks, examining the figures that were cast there, and it was offered as this much needed internalist view of the practice of astrology, which is meant to be a counterpart to whether it's social and cultural, thinking quite broadly the way that astrology has often been treated, but also a counterpart to the kind of work on religious, philosophical, intellectual, and indeed iconographic and other dimensions. So that's something which is, as I say, it's much more particular. Whoops, what's happened here? Let me go back. That was not what was meant to happen there. That was a much more specific view, and I will be equally offering a more specific nitty-gritty view, and that's from, as you will guess, it's from looking at the astrolabe as a technology of astrology. Now, it isn't the only technology of astrology. There are very, very fancy astronomical clocks, which will give you the heavens in motion, driven by mechanism. But the astrolabe is a much more common technology, and you can see, I hope, that it can be rather neat, crisp, sober in appearance, not necessarily flamboyant. And because these devices were so widespread, I think it's quite suggestive that if we hold on to that big picture for a moment, it is rather striking that the astrology and the astrolabe appear together in Europe, and they're very closely interwoven. They come to European prominence at the same time in the 12th and 13th centuries, and they fade away, certainly from the learned world, together in the 17th century. So there's something that is in a coincidence question mark, I think would be the point there. Now, I will be focusing on the astrolabe as technology. I'll be taking you into its operation. But the astrolabe is many things, and I want to just make sure that I'm not looking as if I'm being narrowly and sort of pejoratively an internalist, because the astrolabe has an emblematic role. Here it is, an astrolabe being held there by a figure of Astrology, and this is from an image of all 7 of the liberal arts, where each has representative sort of tools of the trade, so that geometry has large compasses and music has an instrument to play with. So it certainly was emblematic. It certainly has a broad iconographic reach, but it was more than emblematic, because the astrolabe is an operative device. It shapes one's understanding of the heavens through the manipulation of the instrument's parts. And so I do want to take you as much as is possible online into its operation. And I do that because it's an experience that medieval and Renaissance figures commonly had. We can be pretty sure that this was, if you had the means to acquire an astrolabe, you would have handled, used, understood this, and used it as a way to think about the larger cosmos that you're within. And that sort of experience, certainly until the recent past, was one that was much less common for historians. And that's a potential problem if one is going to be trying to understand astrology in practice. So how can we start to get to grips with this as a working device that one operates and manipulates? So firstly, here's a nice clean 14th century astrolabe, and it's an observational device. So on the back of it that you see here, there is a rotating alidade, and that has on it a couple of sights. And that means that with this device, you can take the height of things. Now, you might be taking the height of terrestrial things. And here is the back of an astrolabe in use for just that kind of terrestrial measurement, determining the height of a tower. And it's using similar triangles rather than a measuring staff. And you can see a little bit closer, it has this little shadow box on the back of the astrolabe that lets you do that kind of work. But it is more celebrated for its celestial observation, where we can use the astrolabe to take the height of the sun or star, so raising our gaze upwards beyond the towers in the near foreground. And once one has taken the height and the altitude, the degrees above the horizon of the sun or a star, then one turns over to the front of the astrolabe. So this is the same 14th century Gothic astrolabe, and it has its characteristically elaborate and decorative cutout shape, the so-called rete or arachne, and that captures the heavens, and hence Alberuni calls this instrument the mirror of the stars. And as I say, the astrolabe has sort of many dimensions, so one can see just in passing before we get too enmeshed in the operation of it, that you can get architectural resonance and echoing. You have this quatrefoil decorative form for it that is mirroring not just the stars but contemporary architecture. But when we come to the celestial part, there are these various pointers on the front, and each one of those is for a bright star in the sky, so that you have, that's why it's a mirror of the stars. You've brought the stars down into this plane sphere. You've turned the sphere into a two-dimensional circle, and you can capture some of the stars there. And in addition to the stars, you have the sun, which sort of lives on this ecliptic circle, and the sun will go around that in the course of a year, going through the zodiac signs. And then you have to have a way of relating the heavens to the earth. And so that blue line that's appeared is the horizon for a particular latitude on Earth. And it encloses a kind of a grid that lets you fix the height of the sun or a star in the sky. So there are lots of ways in which the astrolabe can be astrological. I've just very briefly showing you here a rete, so not the whole astrolabe, a rete with the stars and the sun. But in this case, this is so thoroughly astrological that the stars are not even named. They're just identified by their planetary temperaments, the planets that give each star its own particular character. But I'm going to focus more on the doctrine of the houses and how the astrolabe supports the creation of horoscopes as, in effect, a map of the sky. And I want to do that with you by rather bravely switching away from my PowerPoint and making use of a live online astrolabe. I guessed that it would be about 6:10, and because I had such a generous and extensive introduction, I can see it's now gone past 6:10, and I've misjudged that. So I'm going to try.
Don't worry, you get then the additional time in the end. It's like a football game.
So we might have to go to VAR, I know, in current concerns, but I'm going to switch if I can, and hope that you can now see not the static image of Alex Boxer's online astrolabe. I recommend that you Google Alex Boxer Astrolabe afterwards, so you can have a chance to play with this for yourself. But you can see here, this is now 1817 and not 1810 anymore. So this is the sky as it is now. And it's the sky as it is in Oxford. Or near the Oxford, I've got 52 degrees up here. If you can see my mouse. And that looks quite like an astrolabe, quite like the front of an astrolabe. But I want to make it a little bit clearer, you know, by the magic of modern technology. I'm going to turn on the sky so that you can see better where the horizon ends and that illuminated part of the sky that's above the horizon. And I'm also going to turn on the sun, so you now have a nice little icon of the sun. So there is the sky as it is now. And we could sit here very patiently, if Samuel would allow me to, and watch this gradually turn around. But that might be a little dull. So I'm going to speed things up and move the sky on so we can see the sun coming down towards the horizon. And when it hits the horizon, the sky turns dark. Now that's something that a medieval or Renaissance user would have had to imagine, but I don't think it's absurd or anachronistic to sort of project this back on, because that's how it would have been understood. And you can see, I hope, that as the sun goes round, it's got sort of stuck with it a rule that is pointing out to the edge of the astrolabe. And that rule is sweeping round. And I hope you can see with Roman numerals, it's just gone past 3 in the morning. It's now coming up to 4 in the morning. And the sun's come above the horizon. So the sun has risen at about 4 o'clock. And it'll carry on round. And the sky is now nice and bright. And we can see the hours, those clock hours that we're familiar with, being swept out there. And it will come up to, so we've got 9 o'clock. It will come up now towards midday, where the sun is at its highest point in the sky. It's moving over that grid that you can see of the illuminated sky. And those circles are circles of equal altitude. So it's gone past midday and is now coming down in the sky. It's crossing those circular arcs of elevation. And I'm going to let it come a little bit further, get towards the horizon. And then I think I'm going to exercise my sort of megalomaniac powers and just stop the sun in properly biblical fashion. And let's just stop the sun there. So we've moved it on to roughly the same time tomorrow. The astrolabe has turned round once, and 1 day has happened. And I want to just show you what happens if, instead of just going through the minutes and the hours, instead we jump on through the months. So I've got my mouse poised over a month. I've turned it to July. The time stays the same, but the sun is moving outwards towards the edge of the astrolabe. And if I go all the way to December, we then see that although it's the same time, the sun is now below the horizon. The sky has gone dark. So in December, at the time that we're showing here, the sun is now out of sight. It's night already. And if we just go, unfortunately, I've just, I'm going to have to do a bit of adjustment here because I've unclicked the rule. Let's put it back on. And I'm going to just pull this round so I can control this myself. And we can see that if I bring it round, when I want in December, it will show me that sunrise in Oxford will be at about 8 o'clock in the morning. So radically different from what it is 6 months earlier. And so you're immediately getting, as you play with the astrolabe, you are immediately getting a sense of how the seasons work. So that's quite effective. You don't need to be sort of conceiving it. You actually have it at your fingertips. And that's a very striking thing to do. With an astrolabe, you can change your latitude. So why don't we go down to Lisbon, where, you know, it would be lovely to be? And we can see that at Lisbon, in December, at that time, the sun's already up. It's already been up for quite a while. And by manipulating the astrolabe, in an astrolabe, you have different plates for latitudes. You can see how the seasons work, how the heavens relate to the earth. You have a sense of how time operates and how it depends on where you are. So that's quite impressive there. More impressively, we can zip down much further and see that if we go all the way to the equator at 0 degrees, the astrolabe looks very different. It's called the right horizon. And when I set it in motion, and let's put it a bit faster, you can see that in December, half of the 24 hours, the sun is above the horizon and half is below. It's exactly equal, 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. And that happens irrespective of the month. If I change it to June, set it going again, it's exactly the same. So it gives you this sense of how time works. And if you want to be more dramatically different, you can go to the North Pole. And again, the projection of the visible sky is quite different. And you see in June, the sun goes around, it's always visible. In fact, you have a day that lasts for 6 months at the North Pole. And if we go down to December, you will see that the sun never rises, and you have a night of 6 months too. Let me just go back. Let's go back to make me familiar with being in Oxford. And what I want to just get over to you is that if you have done your measurement with the back of the astrolabe, you've taken the height of the sun or the height of a star, what that does is it lets you come to the front and then you can adjust it. If you have measured the sun to be, it's the morning, you've measured the sun to be 30 degrees high in the sky, you find the right circle here, and then you can just read off the time from that index rule. And if you want to do something similar with a star, you measure the height of a star. Say you've measured Altair, and it is 30 degrees as well in the sky. Let's pull this round. It has to be nighttime to be able to see that. And oops, actually, let's make it 60 degrees. There's Altair at 60 degrees here, and you just take off the time from the rule again of the sun. It's the sun that tells you the time. It's not visible, but it tells you that it's a little bit before 9 o'clock at night. So you've got a sort of a snapshot of the sky just by manipulating your astrolabe. And that makes it this very powerful way. I mean, literally, astrolabe means sort of star grabber. And you can think of it almost as a camera, that when you plug in your observation, you capture, you place the sun or a star, and actually you've captured the whole sky as it is at that moment in time. Now, I've been talking at some length with that, but I think it's worth doing to give a sense of this as an operational device. Usually we see astrolabes reproduced on the pages of books, and we might see them stationary in a museum showcase. We get a sense of them as illustrations, but actually they're machines, that you can do things with them, and as you come to know them, you appreciate better the sort of power that they have and the things that they can deliver for you. But you might be at this point getting a little bit impatient, thinking, well, he promised astrology and the astrolabe. When's that coming in? Well, the point about that is that when you have captured the sky, whether from the sun or a star, you have at that moment, let's say we've done it from the sun, and we observe the sun at the height in the sky that gives us this snapshot of the sky. In addition to the time, what the astrolabe gives you is the ascendant. So over here on the eastern horizon, we're in Scorpio, and it's 5, 10, it's about 13 degrees of Scorpio. And that is the ascendant. It is the most fundamental starting point for the majority of astrological operations. So the astrolabe just gives you that. And in some ways, it's sort of more fundamental than the time. You can take an observation of a star, that gives you a snapshot. Yes, you can look where the sun is and tell the time, but immediately you have the ascendant. So it's sort of almost more primordial as a way of capturing the sky. And it's very striking in text on the use of the astrolabe. You can have something like Chaucer's vernacular text on the use of the astrolabe, and that puts time and the ascendant on an absolutely equal level. One is not more important. They're introduced in the same chapter. They're the two fundamental things that you want your astrolabe for. And as well as the ascendant, you have the descendant, the opposite point over here. This is in Taurus, about 13 degrees of Taurus, if you can see that on the western horizon. And you also have, in this case, it's just into Virgo, this 12 o'clock line, the midheaven, and we're just into Virgo, and then the lower midheaven just into Pisces. So you have these 4 cardinal directions, and they are vital for almost all of the house systems that you use in your in creating horoscopes, any form of figure for whether it's a nativity or an election or an interrogation. Now, how does that work in an astrolabe? I have to go a long way down here, and I'm going to turn on what would become the most common form of houses in the Renaissance. Regimentanus houses, they're called, after Johannes Regimentanus, but they have a much older history too. They're known in the Islamic world, and they're known previous to that in the Latin West. And these are fixed houses, so you can engrave them on an astrolabe with these green lines here. And they give you not just the intersections with the ecliptic, with the zodiac signs of those 4 cardinal directions we just saw. They give you 12 intersections, and those define the cusps that you will use on your horoscope. Now, that's not the only house system. The astrolabe can be used with other house systems. Alex Boxer, who created this one online, he particularly likes the Campanus system, slightly differently defined, but also a fixed one that can be engraved on astrolabes. Much less common, but there are a few that I've been working on and starting to sort of weasel out from our museum collections. But the most common standard medieval technique is one called, it's known as the Alcibitius, or John North calls it the standard method. And if I turn off the Regimentanus ones and I turn on Alcibitius cusps, then they are defined differently. They are defined again by these 4 cardinal directions. Here's the ascendant, the intersection of the horizon and the ecliptic. You have this midheaven here, and with the Alcibitius system, you divide that angle into 3 equal parts. They, by symmetry, they come through on this side too, so you have them there, and then you have 3 other equally divided cusps there. And as I say, these never appear on medieval astrolabes, even though it was the standard method. And there's a very simple reason that they don't appear, is because you cannot engrave them. So you might think, well, that looks very easy to engrave, but if we speed it up, this is what they do during the day. Because of the way they're defined, they actually move around and have this slightly mesmerizing effect. The astrolabe lets you work with that, lets you do it, but it's not something that you can fix in the way that you can with that Regimentanus scheme. So I hope that gives you a first sense of how the astrolabe is an astrological machine. I'm going to switch back, if I can, to my PowerPoint and move on to a standard form of Renaissance nativity. This is the one by Girolamo Cardano for Regiomontanus himself, which is an extremely malicious one. It's very amusing what he manages to interpret it to say that Regiomontanus is not such the great guy that you might have thought from his renown and his many publications. And this figure, the celestial figure, the horoscope, the nativity in this case, is just another way of taking a snapshot of the sky at a particular place and moment in time. It demarcates those house cups, 12 house cusps, and it populates this figure with planetary positions. And just to see how that works, there's a mapping between a horoscope and the astrolabe. I'm just liberally borrowing again from Alex Boxer, his very nice book, The Scheme of Heaven, where he's showing here the sky at the birth of Henry VIII, a very simplified astrolabe, and there is Cardano's nativity of Henry VIII. And there's your first house cusp, the ascendant, and that maps on to the traditional square horoscope format. Second one is there, third one is there, and you can work your way around. And that captures, it captures the same layout, but just a very different geometry. And you need to map the planets, so the sun maps like that. There's the moon, and you can map the other planets from their position on that ecliptic circle onto the horoscope to establish the position of everything and to start to make your judgment. There's a very small print notes that you can either try to read or I will skip over it. It doesn't affect what I was saying. Now, if you want to put the planets on there, you need to know where they are. And an astrolabe with just the sun on it does not give you all the other planets. So typically, you need something like what appeared with print. Here's Regiomontanus's ephemerides, which on one side of this opening, you have the positions of the planets through each month, and facing it, you have the angular aspects, the significant relationships between the planets. Ephemerides existed in the medieval world, but print enables them on a totally new scale. So this work by Regiomontanus, 900 pages long. Rich Kramer likes to say this is big data in action. There are 1 million numbers in here, and they're all calculated. They enable you to place the planetary positions onto an astrolabe. You can use them other ways too, but it can work with an astrolabe to establish, to erect a scheme of heaven, to erect a horoscope figure. So that's how it works in general terms. What I want to show you is how the astrolabe was simplified. It's something which is a characteristic feature I want to suggest of the Renaissance. And you have here's this neat, sober astrolabe from the notable French workshop of Fusoris. And it's a complex device. It's a planisphere. It captures the heavens, brings them down into a circle. And in some areas in the Renaissance, the astrolabe was simplified enormously. So in navigation, you have the development of the mariner's astrolabe. It loses all of this projection of the sphere into a disk, and all you have is a scale of angles on one quadrant and this very robust alidade. You're going to use this to take the height of the sun or stars, and you're going to use that to establish your latitude when you're in that familiar narrative of European ocean-going expansion. So that's a really drastic reduction of the astrolabe into a much, much simpler form. Not quite so drastic. You have the transformation of the astrolabe in surveying into a simple theodolite here. You have that alidade still on there. You can see in the upper half, there is that rectangular box, the shadow square, that was also on the back of the astrolabe. This one has a compass added. It's got some fixed sights too, but it very clearly shows the lineage that it comes from and the way the astrolabe is being transformed for special purposes. And that's surveying is becoming a big thing of land management and control through measurement at the time. And these have typically been seen as these successful mathematical arts. This is mathematics as a worldly activity, something that is very engaged in practice. And what I want to suggest is that the astrolabe, as it is used in astrology, gets simplified in a parallel, analogous way. So if we take that astrolabe from the workshop of Fusoris, about 1400, and look instead at 16th century astrolabe, looks rather similar in the back. Yes, it has a coat of arms, but you can see the alidade, so it has that same measurement function. And if you look at the front, it looks similar. You can see the disc there, but actually it is a bit different. And if we zoom in on those two astrolabes, just looking at the retes and keeping them scaled so that ecliptic circle is the same size, suddenly you see this 16th century Wagner astrolabe is radically simpler. It doesn't have this elaborate structure with the star pointers. It's only going to have the sun on it. So it has been stripped down in a very significant way. And you can see, yes, the ecliptic are the same size. They've scaled them to be the same size there, but it is much simpler. There are no stars. And that's not the only way in which we can see the astrolabe changing. So if you look at the plates inside this, the Fusoris one, you have that very visible horizon with the grid above it for the height of things in the sky. It has below the horizon, it's got arcs for the unequal hours. I've not talked about those, but it's a different hour system that was the most common one before clockwork and the equal hours that we're familiar with. When we look at the Wagner one, it doesn't look quite the same. You probably can't make it out very well, but if I just juxtapose them more carefully, then on the right-hand side, this Wagner plate, the grid above the horizon has disappeared. It's only the houses. You can see DO for domus in the upper part, and there's a slightly awkward mix of houses and unequal hours in the lower part. So with a plate like this, what you can do with the astrolabe is dramatically limited. It's not possible to fix the position of the sun above the horizon. You couldn't do the stars, they don't exist on the rete, but you cannot do it. You cannot use this to do a snapshot in the same way for the sun being anywhere in the sky. It just doesn't have those circles of elevation. So it's a very limited device. What would you do with it? You can use it to establish with those house lines, you can establish the grid of the horoscope to know where those house cusps intersect with the ecliptic, and to know where the houses are in that zodiac circle. Now you might wonder, is this just some sort of weird idiosyncratic piece? No, it's something which, as I've been investigating these and looking more closely, it's far from it. In fact, there is a real efflorescence, a really sort of vibrant development of these. And so I'll try to just run through to give you a sense of this, of just how sort of busy it is and how frequently these are. These have hardly been written about, but there are a sort of missing part of the history of the astrolabe, and one that has not been of interest to most historians, see them as astrolabes as time-related, and they're sort of cosmographic. To pick out their astrological function just highlights a different angle from which to see them. So here's one, 1516 in Nuremberg. This is even more reduced, and it has a little, it has a rule, it has that ecliptic circle, and it has the houses and some unequal hours, but that is it. In London, this is slightly earlier. Here's a silvered compendium by Hans Dorn, who we'll come back to if there's time. If you look at the back of that, you can see, yes, there are those characteristic house arcs, that Regiomontano style, and this simplified reading. So here's another instance. I'll try to zip through a tiny astronomical compendium by the noted maker Christoph Schissler from Augsburg. He made quite a few of these things. They often contain simplified geographical, cosmographical, or horary astrolabes. This is the only one that I found that has the houses there, and so has this astrological character. You find them in different places too. This is in Paris, Bibliothèque Sainte Geneviève. It's a planetary clock called the late 15th century that was reworked by Hans Fien. And if you zoom in on this disc, the one that Fien added, are there houses on this with this simplified reading? Yes, there are. Pick them out there. They're slightly obscured by the sort of wavy lines of a different hour system that he's put on there, but they're absolutely there. It's turned on its side, but it's the same pattern as one has seen there. So that's the kind of objects that I pick up on as a museum curator, but you get them in paper too. This extraordinary colored simplified astrolabe has the houses on it too. You can see them a century later. This is in London. This is a very large manuscript astrological astrolabe. You can see that sort of grey pattern there of the houses. And that is not just color, that is text. This is so large that it gives that there is space to give the astrological character of each of the houses. So you have these things in brass, you have them in manuscript, and you have them in print too. So this is end of the 16th century, a marvelous Volvel book by Gallucci in Venice, and that captures exactly that purpose. So this represents really quite a broadly based movement, and it seems like a very direct parallel with those worldly arts of navigation and surveying. And that is, I hope that's persuasive, that this is not just a small, slim thread, but it's happening all over Europe. It's happening in different media, happening at different times. There's quite a broad basis for this. But that isn't quite the end yet, because as we saw, you need with your astrolabe to get to a horoscope, you need to be able to place the sun, the moon, and the other stars. So there's more work to be done if it's going to be a full horoscopic device. And that's where we see some very particular forms of simplified astrological astrolabes. So here is one that's in Milan, about 1500. And it's one where if we zoom in a bit, you can probably just see that there are these scrolls on that familiar pattern of the houses, and those scrolls give you the character of each of the houses, what aspect of life each house governs. And you also have these pointers that can be positioned by hand. A few of them there have got the symbols for the planets. So this is a way of placing the planets with data that comes from elsewhere, and then you have them placed, you have to fix them in some way on the ecliptic circle, and as you turn that wheatie round once in a day, you will see not just the sun, but the planets moving through the houses, and that will give you a basis for understanding and operation. And again, is this one in Milan? Is this a totally unique thing? Well, at the moment is unique, but I don't think it truly is. So here's the one we saw earlier from Nuremberg from 1516. It's fixed in the center there, so you can turn that ecliptic circle round. But it has a pin at the ecliptic pole. Maybe that was for missing planetary pointers that disappeared since then, but could be used in just the way that they are on that Milanese example. And similarly, with that Wagner astrolabe that I was looking at in detail, that has an empty socket at the ecliptic pole. It's identified, polus zodiac. And there's a little hole there, a socket, where there once was an arrangement for having planetary pointers there. So you could also have this as a kind of interactive horoscope. And that's significant, I think, because if you could do that, if you could put these pointers on and you could rotate your viti through the day, that was potentially useful for elections. The planets would stay in the same planetary aspects, they'd have the same relationship, but they would be in different houses. So as you turn it, you're going to get different effects. And if you're trying to determine the right time to found your new church or to go into battle, this is something which I think could be useful, something that is speculative at the moment. I don't have textual evidence for it, but I think it is very, very suggestive. Now, I could finish there, but it would be great if I was given liberty just to zip through one other aspect here and to go from simplicity that I've been talking about so far to complexity. Because at the same time as you have instruments in the practical mathematical arts becoming simpler in the Renaissance, you also have very elaborate, complex ones. So here is this universal instrument from Jacques Besson. One of its uses was meant to be putting it in a giant set of gimbals for navigational use on your ship. That is perhaps a little implausible, you might think. Here is the Henri Mètre, published by Henri de Suberville and dedicated to Henri IV in France. It could be configured as an age. This is sort of ingenious conceit there. And you might think these things are fancy, complex, unlikely to be realized, but there were extremely complex, very elaborate devices made in metal too. So these were not just paper conceits. And you can see, to some extent, a level of complexity with some forms of astrolabe too. So here's this one from Milan again. And if you turn it over, what you have is an equatorial plate. And that is a plate that helps you to work out graphically the positions of the planets. So you don't need those tables that Regiomontanus published as his ephemerides. That's not unique. In Oxford, there is this Nostradamus astrolabe. It may have belonged to him, not created by him, but it may have belonged to him. And on the back of that, that has a different design of equatorial. Very interesting device. So that is this sort of dream of having all of the heavens, all the planets, not just the sun, brought into a single device and to have this autonomous way of capturing the sky and putting it to work. And this one that is associated with Nostradamus, or that may have actually been linked with the father of Horoscopes in the late 15th century, for a bunch of reasons that Emmanuel Poul has very nicely argued for. This not just captures the heavens in a very full way, but it has got very specific astrological uses in it. So one of the plates in it is what's called a tablet of horizons. And it has these arcs on it that let you pick out different latitudes, and you can do a whole bunch of operations, like you can find, well, what is the ascendant, or when does the sun rise, using this. But it's also a plate for a more specialist purpose, and that is for medical astrology. So up at the top there, where that little tab is to hold it in place, it says the onset of disease. And if you go to the side, it's crisis number 1. It's the cycle of critical days. So this is used in what was standard but quite controversial medical doctrine, and it shows the reach of these devices into a whole range of doctrines. And in the same object, there is this plate here. It looks like a more sort of filled in set of the house cusps of those Regiomontanus houses. It's actually marked for hours around the end, but this is divided as circles of position. And I'm going to just say this very briefly because I do want to stop and to leave time for questions. But circles of position, you can see that special art on a globe there. So the astrolabe takes the sphere, in this case, a celestial globe, and that is an adjustable art. You can move it up and down. And with that plate, it enables you to capture that. And you find it on other devices, which can be extremely complex. Late 15th century, a celestial globe here, currently in Krakow, with an astrolabe disc on top of it that you can move around. And this is the best image I have. I hope you can just about make out that it has these circles of position and that this is an astrological directorium. So this is used for the doctrine of directions or prorogations. So it's more elaborate, more connected to the practice of the art than the more basic realm of casting a figure, casting a horoscope. And this is attributed to Hans Dorn, who's best known working in Vienna. Here's another astrolabe attributed to Dorn that's in Florence. And again, I don't have great images, but I think and hope you can just about see that there are these circles of position engraved on there. So these were certainly being created in late 15th century. There's an older tradition that goes with these directoria. It exists in manuscripts. So you have here a Vatican manuscript of a simplified astrolabe, and it has the fixed houses marked in red, but with the additional arcs, these circles of position in there. Now, I've just introduced these very briefly to give you a hint and a suggestion that there's much more to be done here. This is still very much work in progress for me. I'm still pursuing it. So that there are medieval manuscripts on directoria, but there are also printed sources. And so this exposition of it, quite a brief one, on the construction of the astrological directorium. Where would you expect that to appear in a printed source? You think, well, what sort of book in astrology would that be? It appears in Andreas Schöner's book on sundials. And that's a hope, a very nice way to finish, because it reminds us of the way that the practical mathematics of astrology aligned it with those other mundane, exoteric arts. It could be just as it aligns with navigation and surveying, with that simplification of the astrolabe. It also could fit in with the realm of sundials. And so I hope, just as a word of conclusion, I hope that you're persuaded of the vitality and the diversity of the material culture of Renaissance astrology. And I want to just leave you with a kind of natural follow-on question, what happens next? And if there is that alignment that I've been suggesting, what becomes of astrology, and particularly this practical, mathematical, instrumental, material form of it, what becomes of that after the 16th century? And what might it say about that larger transformation, the marginalization of astrology that I alluded to right at the start, when it begins to disappear out of the rounded world? So what could we infer from that? I'm going to leave that hanging as a question, and I will say thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stephen. This was a marvelous talk, and we open immediately the discussion. Perhaps given the number of persons in the room, I can't see everybody, so the best thing is that you raise your hand and your rectangle will be shifted to the top, so I can see who wants to intervene. Boris Jardine has a question.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah, it's not actually Boris. It's Josh Knoll here. I'm sat here next to Boris. We're watching this on the big screen like it's a football match.
Beats watching England, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Scotland too, actually, to be honest.
Thank you. That was an amazing talk, Stephen. I've got a question about mechanical timekeeping, because I remember when you were looking at the Whipple's astrological astrolabe that we have, a German one, you described it to me, this simplification of the form, in part as perhaps as a consequence of the advent of mechanical timekeeping as a commonplace, which would enable presumably the setting of the ecliptic just by looking at a clock. You wouldn't even have to look at the altitude of the sun. Those things are happening at roughly the same time, it seems to me. But is there a causal relationship between these, or does it just happen to make it that bit easier to use, or is the simplification in part a function of this change in timekeeping practice?
Thanks for that, Josh. The sequence and the relationship, I don't know for sure, I have to say. And that I think that if one goes to the end of the period that I've been talking about, I imagine that if you have someone like Simon Foreman, who's casting multiple figures a day, he's seeing many people in a single day for consultations. I imagine that he is using a clock to get the time, and then he's probably using tables actually rather than an astrolabe. So I think that's partly what happens there. So the clock does come in. It does make a difference. You can do things without. So I think there is a relationship. As I say, I'm just not clear. I was probably, when I was with you examining that particular astrolabe, that was an enthusiastic moment of speculation. It does make sense, and it is, it would be nice because the astrolabe clearly does respond to the advent of mechanical timekeeping. That's when you start to get those equal hours push around the outside. So the astrolabe definitely does change in relation to clocks. So it's a natural thought. I think I'm going to have to think about it. I'm going to leave it hanging there, but it is. I may believe what I told you, but who knows?
Thanks, Stephen.
So just to tell you that in the chat that you probably don't see, there are many reactions, enthusiastic applause, thank you, etc., by many people. You can look at this afterwards. Some people have needed to leave the room. So let's move to the next question. Günther, please.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Stephen. I'm wondering how many astrolabes with the Campanus house division have you found already?
So far, I have in Europe, I have a single one that is in Nuremberg. There are ones which use that principle of division in the Islamic world. In Oxford, we've got an 11th century Andalusian astrolabe, which uses that for sort of fixed houses. So it does exist, incredibly rare, but I'm on the lookout for them. And one way that I found it easy to do that is that using Alex Boxer's astrolabe, it's a great way for quickly figuring out. You can just have an overlay on an image of an astrolabe and go, I thought that was, because people just tend to see astrolabes and they get catalogued as being, there are the astrological houses and it's assumed that they're Regiomontanus ones. But as I say, one has to look at it quite carefully. And So far, I found one, but I'm ever the optimist, and I expect that there may be some more.
Have you a picture
Maybe
of
you
it?
have more. Maybe you have more.
Have you a picture of this Nuremberg astrolabe, or do you have the CCA number?
From my screen at the moment, I cannot bring it up. I think it'll take me too long, but I would be very happy to send you the link. It's available online.
Oh yeah, this would be very kind of you.
Yeah. I'm happy to do that because, and it's easy. You know that one had John North talking about the standard Alcubitius method, and then it seems as if, and he even talked about there being a minor revolution with Regiomontanus, and that sort of sweeps all before it with the combination of tables and instruments. But so I
Well,
think
Campanus house tables weren't widespread. This probably accounts for the rarity of astrolabes to this house division.
Yeah. But I think it's worth being on the lookout because it would be nice to try to recover a more active sense of debate.
Yeah.
Because I think that was there certainly in the late 15th century. I think when the Regiomontanus stuff was brand new, you got people like Dawn using it, but I think there was still uncertainty there, and that's a nice moment to try to get back to in greater detail.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, there was a question in the chat from the start by Evan Boxer Cook. He cannot turn on his mic probably, so I will just read it to you, Stephen.
Yeah.
He asks, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the purpose of the second ecliptic on the Nostradamus astrolabe. Might it be used to adjust for precession?
So, is it worth me sharing to go back to?
I think so, because not everybody has this on their mind. It's a complex piece.
Let me go back if I can. Is that showing up now?
Yeah, we can see your slide spinning backwards.
So what's being asked about there is the fact that you can see a simple reading here with the ecliptic circle, and there's another one underneath it, which is much broader. So the one underneath, what that lets you do is to work with latitudes as well as just having the line of the ecliptic itself. Now, was that being done and actually it might look as if these arcs here are perhaps houses, but they are just going to the ecliptic pole. So I think this is for working with latitudes that, and you know, it's known that there was an interest, an astrological interest in latitudes in the 15th century. People were trying to see, would that make a difference if you could take latitude into account? I don't have a view on sort of precession. That seems to me, this latitude thing seems to me to be the most likely purpose, but I'm very open to ideas, and I need to actually go back and look again at what Emmanuel Poole wrote about this, because it escapes my mind exactly just now, but he studied this very carefully because it has the equatorium on the back. But I'd be very glad to have thoughts from anybody else here as to other possibilities.
I see another question from Daryl.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful talk, Stephen. Illuminating. I have one comment and one question. The question is, were these simplified astrolabes kind of mass-produced, or were they significantly less expensive than the more elaborate ones in such a way that more astrologers would be able to buy them and use them?
So, mass-produced, I don't think so. They're not like the astrolabes of Georg Hartmann, which were mass-produced in a certain sense. Both the ones in metal seem to have been batch-produced, so several will be made at the same time, and they're identified by little numbers to say this is number 4 of the batch.
All right.
So there really was thinking about it. And of course, Hartman is thinking about a larger, more exciting form of mass production at the time, which is printing. So Hartman produces paper printed astrolabes, and that really is mass production.
Sure.
None of his ones are, that I know of at the moment anyway, are the simplified kind. So I'm not sure, but he does have the houses on them. You know, he has regimentalis houses. He's trying to follow regimentalis as much as possible. So you can do everything there, and it may be that for Hartman, well, if you can sort of mass produce in that, like with print, you don't need to worry about the cost implications, because it's already going to be so much cheaper. And having these paper ones which you paste onto a piece of wood, and you have a little bit of brass for the anodate and so on, but you can bring the price down and have all the deluxe features that you come to expect.
Sure. Thank you. And then the comment is, from my perspective, I'm not sure that operative is the best term for what you're trying to describe with astrolabes, because I think it makes it ambiguous with the distinction that Roger Bacon makes between judiciaria and operativa astrology, which is not the same distinction you're trying to make, which sounds maybe practical or mechanical or something like that. But if you want to keep operative, maybe to say more explicitly that you're not making the same distinction that Roger Bacon is.
So I can reassure you that Bacon was not in my thoughts when I was talking there. And in fact, it's only because over the last few months, I've read a lot of the work of Jim Bennett again, after he died last year. And so he has a piece that is about operative knowledge. And so that's what I had in mind. And he has some very nice comments about how we typically think about disciplines being constituted by texts and techniques and language. We have a whole set of sort of textual references that we think of that constitute disciplines. And he just makes the nice point that actually objects can be very powerful things for constituting it. And I think as a general point, I mean, it is very striking that, Eurasian astrology, which shares so much in common, I think all the people who were doing that, had the astrolabe in mind as the way of thinking about how you understand and interpret what's going on and how you can manipulate it. So that was it was a very different source that I had in mind. But I will bear your caution in mind, and either sort of drop the term or have a more appropriate one, or have Bacon come into the show, I think.
Thank you very much. I'll look forward to seeing how your thoughts evolve on all this.
Yes.
Stephen, listening to you was wonderful, and it was overwhelming to see the many examples that you have gathered, and maybe you have more in your list, or anyway, it was enough. Did I get you right that you're suggesting that there's a kind of crescendo, increasing production of this kind of simplified astrolabes towards the last quarter of the 15th century and then 16th century? Or where do you see this temporally going on above all? Or how do you interpret this distribution? I mean, you will perhaps say, well, we don't know what's going on with the manuscript ones that have disappeared.
Yeah. So I mean, it was a little bit naughty of me, but I was trying to be a bit overwhelming, because it would be easy to say, well, here's one or two examples of these things. But actually, it's very good to get the sense that there's so much of it. It's incredible, and I wasn't showing all of it. And actually, I should just, before responding to that thing about what is the trajectory over time, I should just say that this isn't all this isn't, you know, much as I would like to think so, it's not all my work. So Günther had published in his book on Rantzau, had published several of these. I think, was it 4 or 5, I think, were known at the time. Gerard Turner had published a little list of very closely overlapping. But you know, what's striking is that, you know, as I've been looking harder and looking at manuscripts as well as objects, you know, the number really has grown. And I didn't show all of them, you know, that as Josh said, that there's one in Cambridge, which I didn't show. Sorry, Josh, if you're still there. But you know, because there are more, and I wanted to try and give that sense of the diversity of the media as well. This is not just something, it's, you know, for people who work with manuscripts, I'm sure that there are more out there that I don't know about at the moment, and so that's what I want to try and get the word out, because that there must be more to do. Because I still see myself as being in this, in a sort of gathering exercise and trying to make the cornucopia more overwhelming. I think I'm a little bit cautious about trying to say the shape of the wave that this follows. It certainly does seem to be something that begins late 15th century is my impression. But I don't quite know how it relates, for example, to the early tradition of directoria, these ones with circles of position, which is an older medieval tradition, and I just don't have a firm handle on that at the moment. So I don't want to be too cavalier in suggesting it, but it is definitely the case that you know, late 15th and into the 16th century, one sees them in paper, in parchment, in metal. You have this dispersion in time and place. You know, it's a bit, for me, it's a bit amorphous at the moment. And maybe it'll be possible to say something eventually. But you know, when Gallucci was publishing his at the end of the 16th century, you know, lots of his stuff comes from Appian, and Appian has his geographical mirror, simplified astrolabe there, but not for astrology. He may have been sort of, you know, picking up on stuff that was much older, you know, from 70 years before, rather than things that were from 10 or 20 years before. So that it could be quite a sort of patchy trajectory of things that are not a smooth curve of growth and excitement and then are fading away. It could be other kinds of sort of referencing going on. So that's not a very good answer, I know, but it's kind of, at the moment I don't feel I need to have an answer, I suppose. That's, you know, that it's enough to be gathering to see where it goes. Sorry to dodge it.
No, but I think that's good. Look, I think it's so interesting that we are allowed to extend the time of this seminar today, exceptionally. It's the last in the series anyway. But we have now 5 persons who would like to ask a question. And so in order not to go too much over time, let's try to be brief. So I've seen in the TED, I don't know who was first, but I think Rich Kramer has a little cue in the chat, and I would like to pass
I think Louise had his hand up long before me, so maybe Louise, you should go first.
All right. If Louise is first, then Louise is first.
Okay, it's just a small commentary. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. If this is just a sample of what you have, I'll be waiting to be even more overwhelmed with the rest of the material. But I would just like to comment that what you're presenting here, it's, I think, an extraordinary important facet of astrological practice, because, of course, we have the books, we have the theoretical books. Most of the research and most of our knowledge, it comes from the manuals and the books that pass on. That needs to be compared with actual practice of astrology, which is something I have been focused on in the last years, and Elena was also focused on that. You know, what exactly from all that theoretical corpus is being actually applied on practice and it's being used. And here we have, as you said very well, the material, another material aspect of that practice, you know, all the instruments and paraphernalia that will accompany this practice and are showing what do they need, you know. So I think it's quite important that these instruments might fill gaps where we don't have any more workbooks or you know, actual evidence of astrology, which unfortunately we don't have many because it doesn't survive unless it happens to be gathered by a library or something like that. So I think this kind of study fills and complements, you know, the study of actual workbooks of astrologers and actual judgments that we can find. So I'm eager to see how your research develops.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luis. And just, I won't take much time to respond, given we're looking at the clock, but it works both ways actually, because just as with the standard Alcibiades method for the houses, astrolabe texts tell you how to use that on an astrolabe, but there's no visible trace because they're not fixed houses. They move around, and I think. And I don't yet. I'm still a bit of a, you know, I'm still in the elementary foothills of astrological practice, I would say, for myself. I suspect it's the same with directions, so that you can have fixed circles of position using a sort of regiomontanus or campanus style, but the equivalent of the standard method for the houses is also a sort of mobile thing on an astrolabe. So I don't know if there are texts that tell you how to do that. I suspect there are, but you know, it's a different definition, a different way of doing it. So the instruments can have gaps that because of the nature of the practice, and so you have to work between both text and object, I would say.
We move to Rich.
Well, my comment's going in the same direction as these two. It seems to me that we need a digital humanities project on 16th century tools for doing house divisions. You know, nobody has really tried to study this carefully. You're starting, Stephen, in the astrolabe, but we need to look at the books too. You know, we've got the ephemerides, and we know what the editions are of the ephemerides, but how many other publications were there in the 16th century that gave tables for doing house divisions? And this needs to be a big quantitative project. Most 16th century prints are scanned now, so it's really easy to work in 16th century printed materials. And if there's somebody out there looking for a project, you know, there must be literally hundreds of editions of printed books that have house tables in them. And we need somebody to go through and just see what are the systems. And then we can get the curve that Louise was talking about. You know, okay, so is it a curve? At first it was this system and then it was that system. John North speculated about that, but he did not do anything systematic in terms of looking at the surviving printed editions. And it would be, I think it'd be fairly easy to do this. It would just take a little bit of labor and as the Germans say, Sitzfleisch, to sit there and do it. But I think it would be wonderful to bring again to this notion of the practice. So it's not the theoretical text, but it's the practice of astrology. And who cared about the house divisions, and which house divisions did they use? And were there debates about which house division to use? I mean, there was some about regiomontanus, but again, I think we have much more to learn. So that you're working with the brass, Stephen. Yeah. And I think if we can encourage people working with the printed material too, this has the possibility to really open up some deeper knowledge about astrological practice in the 16th century.
Well, Rich, let's make a plan.
Yes, yeah, indeed. You know, that's where funding is available for DH projects, I would say. So it's certainly possible. And I'd be very happy to be contributing to that. And the one little comment that I would make, you know, that it's absolutely right that John North had these comments, and sometimes they're a little bit contradictory, you know, different things that he said in different places. And it's also the case that in astrolabe texts, very often, there will be an account of 2 or 3 different house systems to tell you about them. And what is striking to me is that, it's tempting to think when you see a Renaissance astrolabe with Regiomontanus houses, you think, well, that's become the new standard technique, that's the norm. But it's perfectly possible for someone to own one of those and think Regiomontanus is wrong, and you should use the Alcubitius standard one, because that doesn't show up. How would you know? And it doesn't appear on it, but you could still prefer that. And so that there's a kind of, we've got to be careful not to sort of talk ourselves into a revolution when the nature of the evidence is necessarily partial. So I think there is scope for genuine inquiry there, sort of fresh inquiry.
Michael.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'll be quick here. I'm not going to suggest a big data project, but just to follow up on your pointing out that so far it seemed you only have one example, beautiful example from Milan that belonged to Citala, which had the planetary pointers moving around the pole. I think it'd be wise to look at the Tobias Volkmar astrolabe that is said to have belonged to Rudolf II in Hamburg, right? As it has manual planetary pointers that are centered in this way. It's not a simplified astrolabe point you've seen, and I don't have an image right now that would allow us to look at the house divisions, but I can share this with you later. That might be a second such example of facilitating elections and other things you talked about. Thanks again.
Thank you, Michael. And yes, there are other things. There are other things too. I mean, something that Michael, I've only seen remotely. Michael has seen in person. There is a Burgi clock in Stockholm, which has this marvelous kind of moving Riti, but it's actually the fixed part because the stars are in place, and the Riti thing turns round, and that has the houses, and it's a bigger projection than normal, so you can see where the arcs all join up, and it just adds to that sense of diversity and the richness of this world that we're in. Thank you.
Boris or Josh?
Have they ever both been seen in the same room at the same time?
Yeah, we can't conceal this.
You're also... Oh yes, they're not the same person.
My daughter's also at risk of wandering into shot. I'll be brief. You showed the Thomas Hood examples. Mm-hmm. Are they the only known English examples of this kind of instrument? And then I was thinking about that because you have a late and quite prolific tradition of astrolabe making, and also of a rich astrological culture. So then I wondered, are these made as part of local traditions that circulate quite narrowly, or do they just turn up wherever the need arises? So if you could talk a little bit about geographical distribution, and then whether there are any other English examples, that'd be great. Thanks.
Well, the English example is actually quite easy to do because, much to my surprise, there is quite a well-known astrolabe by Humphrey Cole, this giant one that's in St Andrews. That has a simplified Riti, and even more. I've not seen it in person for many decades, but they have images online now. And when I went to look at it, I could see there was something at the ecliptic pole that could have been a fixing point for other stuff. So that could have been another one that had planetary pointers, possibly. So that was quite a surprise to me. I wasn't expecting that. So it's maybe not a unique one for Hood, to different medium. On the more general question of geographical distribution, at the moment, what strikes me is it's almost the opposite of being, sort of some little fine thread that is followed through. It just seems to, you start looking, and yes, there is some stuff hands down, late 15th century, but after that, there are German things, there are Italian or French, later on English ones. It really is surprisingly broadly distributed. And the question is all of this connected? Is some of it people just thinking, well, I'm just going to have a cheap, you know, as Darryl was asking, I only want it for this purpose. I'm just going to get a cheap one made and not have all of the complexity of the projection of the Riti. I have not, I would say, just because I've been sort of holding back, because I still feel things are coming in. And I didn't want to sort of rush to try and, you know, pick out a general picture too early. But at the moment, I haven't sort of been struck by, you know, oh, there's an obvious shifting in time, you know, a pattern, if you can map it in some way. It hasn't struck me that so far, which is kind of interesting. I think this makes it almost more interesting because it's puzzling, you know, what are the connections, how is it working? But it suggests that there's more to do, and there's probably more out there that will help to make those connections clearer. So it's very provisional. Hooray, yes. The scouts, is it the scouts or the guides? I don't know what it is nowadays.
Marisa.
Yes, I'm here.
You're the last in our row of questions, so very happy to see you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I am grateful for this wonderful talk. I have seen many friends, and I've heard them before me, before my intervention, and as they know, probably nobody else, I am really interested in mechanical astronomical clocks, and I have been a strong supporter of the idea since many, many years of the astrological use of astronomical mechanical clocks. And I have a question. As Alphabetius houses are extremely interesting, my question is, has anyone explored if this kind of astrological astrolabes have been present also in the Islamic production? So in the Eastern world, or at least in the world dominated by the Islamic science influence, are these astrological astrolabes found or not?
So yes, to some extent, but I have not seen simplified ones in the way that I was talking about today. But there are, and I have not done a systematic survey. I would love to sort of go on to that. I've just been dipping my toes in, because there is a learned literature that comes from the mathematics of astrological techniques, like casting the rays, that one has in the Islamic world, and some of those techniques result in fixed systems that are possible to engrave on instruments. So they do exist. I mentioned just in passing, you know, that there's from Al-Andalus, this Guadalajara astrolabe that is in the Oxford collection from the 11th century, that seems to be using the Campanus projection, so that you have this fixed system that shows up with the houses and then divided into 3 parts. And I'm not quite sure whether that is pure houses. It certainly is houses, because they're named as being ascendant first, ascendant, second, third, fourth, all around to 12. And there are others that David King, you know, has published on several of these kind of interesting ones. And some of them, there is one in particular, which I cannot remember where it is just now, but it has on different plates, it's got multiple house systems. So it shows you different house systems. And you know, there has been work's already been done on this, connecting to some extent with the instruments. The moment my sense is that more of it has been done about the texts, you know, I think as one would expect. But I think there is scope for more vigorously chasing after that in the Islamic world. And that would be very interesting, because I don't know so much about more of the literature that's been published is as it were the textual, intellectual, theoretical side of it, and much less about the practice of astrology in the Islamic world. And that's something which I'm not linguistically competent to do, but I would, and it might not be a digital humanities project, but I hope people are going to be doing that, because it would be very, very valuable.
Thank you.
Well, I promised that we would stop after 4 questions, but it would be sad because I see there is Victor Rosillo that would like to ask a question. So we make an exception and take one more question, but this is really the last one.
Thank you, Samuel. Just to say that there are 2 books, very important, that are catalogs of the Astrolabes of Al-Andalus. And
yes.
So this one, which is the first one, has a table of all the astrological parts on all these Astrolabes from Al-Andalus, which is until 1500. So you might be interested. I cannot share the screen. If I could share the screen, you could see it clearly.
Yeah.
For one reason.
Azucena Hernandez.
It's Azucena Hernandez Perez, and it's published by the University Complutense, and it's all Spain and Portugal astrolabes until the 1500s.
Thank you for reminding me of that, because when she came to Oxford, and so I was there when she was busy studying, taking apart and weighing all the Oxford Andalusi astrolabes. So it's just my temporarily forgetting about it. But I've been thinking I have to go back and look at that, because I've been looking at that Guadalajara astrolabe that I've mentioned a couple of times, because it's going to be lent for an exhibition. And let's maybe look at it again. And I've actually been thinking, I must go back and look at her catalogue again, because she really studied it very, very closely. And I can see there's a chat thing from Josep, who's obviously published a lot on the casting of the rays and similar things.
Thank you, Stephen, for your wonderful presentation today. Thank you.
I think we all join Victor in thanking again Stephen for this wonderful talk and for the good discussion and question. Thank you very much. So I think there were other questions of people who would like to have intervened, but there was no time. And may I encourage them just to send you an email? Stephen, I think I can do this.
By all means, yes, yeah.
And yes, look into the chat also. The expressions of thanks, etc., are very numerous. So thank you all again, and thanks Luis Vero and Luis Tirapix, who are also kind of doing the really serious part of the work in organizing these seminars. We hope to be back next year with another series, and I hope to welcome you all to more about ancient astronomy and astrology.
Thank you, Samuel and Luis for organizing this.
Thank you very much for having me.